Have you ever wondered what it felt like to wake before dawn in a world without walls, without clocks, without the future tugging at your thoughts? Just the cold breath of morning, the crunch of frost underfoot, and the quiet understanding that today meant only one thing: survive, and maybe, if you were lucky, feel alive. Imagine a night where fire was the only boundary against darkness, where stars didn't sprinkle the sky, they flooded it. So many that the world above felt louder than the world below, each constellation a silent companion. Tonight, we're stepping back, far back, into a time when humans were few, the earth was colder, and every footstep had meaning. A time before agriculture, before permanent homes, before the noise that now fills every corner of our lives, when the only teachers were wind, ice, and the great herds drifting across the open world. And here's the quiet truth that might surprise you. In ways that are easy to overlook, those distant ancestors, despite hunger, danger, and endless cold, may have lived with a clarity and balance we can barely imagine. They may have known something essential, something we, with all our comfort and abundance, have slowly misplaced. If this gentle journey through the past helps you rest, if it gives you a moment of stillness in a restless world, feel free to like the video and subscribe to Epic Boring History. It simply helps these soft stories find others wandering through long nights, seeking a calmer place to drift. And if you'd like to share in the quiet, leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Some of you may be wrapped in darkness, others may be watching the first silver hints of dawn. Each of us separated by distance, yet sharing this same slow walk through time. Now let the room dim around you. Maybe there's a fan nearby, or the soft echo of streetlights outside your window. Settle deeper into wherever you are, breathe in, and let the present blur just a little. We're going somewhere older than memory, to a world where humans traveled in small, wandering bands under enormous skies, where survival required attention, curiosity, and courage, and where life moved to rhythms we've almost forgotten. Let's begin. Imagine yourself waking in the hours before true dawn, when the darkness hasn't yet begun to soften at its edges. The cold reaches you first, not as a shock, but as a slow insistence, creeping through the layered hides that cover you, finding the spaces between your body and the furs. You become aware of your breath before anything else, each exhalation visible in the dim space, small clouds that dissipate almost as soon as they form. The fire that burned through the evening has collapsed into a bed of dull embers, still radiating a faint warmth, but not enough to hold back the morning chill. Around you, others are beginning to stir, their movements careful and quiet in the close space. There is no privacy here, no separate chambers or walls that create distance between one person and another. You've slept pressed close to others, sharing warmth through the coldest hours, and you've become so accustomed to the sound of their breathing that its absence would feel strange. Your body aches in the way it always does upon waking, nothing sharp, just a deep weariness that lives in your muscles and joints, the accumulated cost of yesterday's walking, yesterday's work, yesterday's cold. You're young still, perhaps 20 winters old, but your hands already bear the marks of countless small injuries, calluses, scars, fingers that sometimes stiffen in the cold. Someone rises first, an older woman moving with practiced quiet toward the embers. She adds small pieces of dry wood, coaxing the fire back to life with patient breath. The flames grow, and with them comes the first real warmth of the day, drawing others gradually toward the light. You unwrap yourself from the sleeping furs slowly, reluctant to trade their weight and warmth for the morning air. The hides you've been sleeping under are old, worn soft with use, heavy with the accumulated oils of skin and smoke. They smell of earth and animals and human life, a scent so familiar it's almost imperceptible. The clothing you wear has never truly left your body. You've slept in most of it, adding and removing layers as the night grew colder or warmer. Now you adjust the wrappings around your feet, checking that the grass stuffing inside your leather foot coverings hasn't bunched or dampened during the night. Wet feet in this cold can mean injury that lingers for weeks. Your first task, as it is most mornings, involves checking your tools. The spear you've been working on for several days leans against the sloped wall of the shelter, its wooden shaft smooth from your handling, its stone point still sharp. You run your thumb carefully along the edge of the flint blade, feeling for any chips or fractures that might have appeared. This spear is not truly yours in the way we might think of ownership. If someone else needed it, they would take it, and you would understand. But for now, you've invested time in its making, and you're responsible for its readiness. Your life and the lives of those around you might depend on tools like this remaining sharp, balanced, properly hafted. The woman tending the fire has placed stones near the flames, heating them slowly. Later, these stones will be dropped into a hide-line depression filled with water, bringing it to a boil for a thin morning broth made from dried meat, and whatever roots were gathered days ago. But that takes time, and time in the morning is measured by the growing light, not by any constructed schedule. You move outside the shelter, stepping from the close warmth into the broader cold of early morning. The sky above holds that particular quality of pre-dawn light. Not quite dark, not yet bright, a bluish dimness that makes distances hard to judge. The landscape around you is a mix of sparse trees and open ground, rolling away in gentle rises toward a river valley you cannot quite see from here. The ground is hard, touched by frost, and your breath still forms small clouds. You walk a short distance from the camp to relieve yourself, then return, noticing as you do the tracks left in the frost-touched earth. Your own footprints from yesterday. The smaller prints of children, the deeper impressions left by the heaviest members of your group. Back near the fire, others have gathered, perhaps 12 or 15 people in total. This is your world, these faces, these voices. You've known them all since childhood, or they've known you. Some are blood relatives, others connected through the complex web of kinship and obligation that holds your small group together. There are no greetings in the formal sense, no good mornings exchanged. People acknowledge each other with glances, with small gestures, with the simple fact of proximity. You take your place near the fire, not too close. The warmth is rationed by unspoken understanding, with the eldest and the youngest given priority. The light continues to grow, revealing more of the landscape, the dark line of trees to the east, the open ground stretching away to the west, the shapes of the hills beyond. Somewhere out there, if the weather holds and fortune favors you, there are animals, deer perhaps, or the larger aurochs if you travel far enough. But you cannot know for certain until you walk and watch and wait. An older man, your mother's brother, begins speaking quietly, discussing the day's plans. His words are measured, unhurried, giving time for others to think, to add their observations. Someone saw fresh tracks yesterday, heading north. Another remembers that the small valley where pine nuts can be gathered should still have some remaining. A third person worries about the weather, noting the particular quality of the clouds that arrived late yesterday. These discussions never feel rushed, never carry the tension of disagreement that might fracture the group. Consensus emerges gradually, almost as if the decision makes itself. Today, it seems, some will go north to track the deer signs, while others will remain near camp, working on tasks that require the fire and the relative shelter of the established camp. You'll be going with the tracking party. This is understood without it being said directly. You're young, your eyes are sharp, your feet are quick. The older hunters need younger people to help carry whatever might be brought down, to move through difficult terrain, to keep watch. The thin broth is ready now, passed around in a carefully made wooden bowl that someone crafted seasons ago. Each person takes a few mouthfuls, enough to quiet the empty feeling, not enough to truly fill. The taste is subtle, slightly salty from the dried meat, earthy from the roots warmed by the heated stones. You drink slowly, letting the warmth spread through your chest. As the morning brightens, you begin preparing for the day's hunt. This means checking your clothing for tears, making sure your footwear is secure, taking an extra hide to wrap around your shoulders when the walking stops. You collect several small pieces of flint, not finished tools, but workable cores that can be shaped if something breaks during the day. The group that will hunt today numbers 5, 3 men, including yourself, and 2 women whose tracking skills are valued. One of the older hunters carries a heavier spear designed for the thrust that might, with luck and courage, bring down a large animal. The rest carry lighter weapons, better for smaller game, for defense if something dangerous appears. You set out as the sun breaks fully above the horizon, its light slanting across the frost-touched ground. The cold is still present, but no longer quite so bitter, and the walking helps warm your body, blood moving through muscles that were stiff upon waking. You follow the older hunter, watching where he places his feet, learning the small lessons that aren't taught with words, how to move quietly, how to read the texture of the ground, how to sense when an animal might be near. The landscape rolls past slowly. You're not moving fast, not rushing. Tracking requires patience, attention, a willingness to stop frequently and examine the ground, the broken vegetation, the small signs that animals leave behind. Sometimes you walk for an hour, seeing nothing of interest. Sometimes a set of tracks leads you in a wide circle, only to peter out in rocky ground where nothing can be read. The cold is your constant companion, not painful exactly, but always there, always requiring awareness. Your fingers grow numb after a while, and you have to pause to warm them against your body, tucking them under your arms until sensation returns. The older hunter does the same. This is not weakness, but simple necessity. By midday, you've traveled perhaps the distance of several long arrow shots from camp, though the terrain has made the journey feel longer. The tracks you've been following, deer, you're fairly certain, have become fresher, and the group's attention sharpens. Words cease almost entirely now. Communication happens through gestures, through pointed fingers, through the tilt of a head. You spot the deer first, 3 of them browsing on the exposed bark of young trees in a small depression ahead. Your heart quickens, but you've learned to keep your movements controlled, to breathe quietly through your nose, to avoid any sudden motion that might alert the animals. The older hunter has already seen them too. His hand moves in a subtle gesture that everyone understands. Stay low, move slowly, prepare. The next quarter hour unfolds with agonizing slowness. The hunters spread out slightly, each taking a position that gives them an angle toward the deer without exposing themselves. You move on your stomach for part of it, the cold ground pressing against your chest, small stones digging into your elbows. Your spear is beside you, ready, but not yet raised. The attempt, when it comes, is both sudden and inevitable. The lead hunter rises and throws in a single fluid motion, his spear arcing through the air toward the nearest deer. The animal sees the movement, begins to bolt, but the spear catches it in the shoulder, not a killing blow, but enough to slow it, to injure it, to make it stumble. The other deer vanish almost instantly, crashing through the brush with surprising speed, but the injured one struggles, trying to run on 3 legs, bleeding from the wound. The hunters pursue, not running exactly, but moving with purposeful speed, surrounding the animal, preventing its escape. What follows is not glorious. The deer fights, terrified and hurt, and it takes several more thrusts with spears before it finally stills, its breathing becoming labored, then ceasing altogether. You stand there afterward, breathing hard, feeling the strange mix of relief and sorrow that always accompanies a kill. The older hunter kneels beside the animal, speaking words you don't fully understand, a prayer perhaps, or an apology, or a thanks. This is important, this acknowledgement. The deer has given its life so that your group might eat, and that gift requires recognition, requires respect. The work of butchering begins immediately. This is necessary. You're far from camp, and the meat must be reduced to portable pieces that can be carried back. The hunters work with practiced efficiency, using sharp flint blades to open the body cavity, to separate the hide from the flesh, to cut through joints and muscle. Your hands become slick with blood, the warmth of it startling against the cold air. The smell is strong, not unpleasant exactly, but intense, primal, the smell of life transforming into food. You work carefully, saving the hide, setting aside the organs that can be eaten, separating the bones that might be useful. By the time you finish, the sun has passed its highest point and begun its slow descent toward the western horizon. The deer has become a collection of wrapped bundles, meat tied with sinew, hide rolled and secured, organs placed in a section of the stomach lining that serves as a crude bag. Each person will carry part of this weight back to camp. The return journey is slower, the loads heavy and awkward. Your shoulders begin to ache after the first period of walking, and you have to pause frequently to adjust the weight, to shift the bundles from one position to another. The older hunter sets the pace, steady, unhurried, acknowledging that everyone is tired, everyone is carrying as much as they can manage. You walk through the afternoon light, watching your shadow stretch longer beside you. The landscape seems different now. You're more tired, less attentive to detail, focused simply on placing one foot ahead of the other. Your mind drifts sometimes, thinking about the warmth of the fire, about the meal that will come from this kill, about the relief of setting down this weight. The cold deepens as the sun lowers, your breath forms larger clouds, and the light takes on that particular golden quality of late afternoon, beautiful and melancholy at once. You think about how many times you've walked this same landscape, how many days have unfolded in precisely this pattern: wake, track, hunt, carry, return. The repetition is both comforting and exhausting. When camp finally comes into view, you feel a wash of relief so profound it's almost physical. The sight of the shelters, the thin line of smoke rising from the fire, the figures of those who remained behind, all of it represents rest, warmth, food, the end of the day's struggle. The group that stayed at camp comes to meet you, seeing the bundles you carry, understanding immediately that the hunt was successful. There are no celebrations exactly, no loud expressions of joy, but there's a shared satisfaction, a collective exhale. Tonight there will be fresh meat, more than the usual sparse portions, and that simple fact colors everything. You set down your load near the fire, feeling the immediate relief in your shoulders, the way your body seems to lighten without the weight. Your hands are numb again, and you hold them toward the flames, gradually coaxing feeling back into your fingers. The pain of returning circulation is sharp but brief. The evening work begins almost immediately. The meat must be processed further, some of it cut into thin strips that will be dried over smoke, some of it prepared for immediate cooking. The hide must be cleaned, stretched, and staked out. The bones must be split to access the marrow, their fragments saved for tool-making. You help where you're needed, working alongside others in the fading light. The tasks are familiar, requiring little thought, and your mind drifts again, this time into a kind of peaceful emptiness. Your body moves through the work, while your awareness softens, observing without quite being present. As darkness gathers, the fire is built up larger than usual, a luxury permitted by the day's success. The meat cooks slowly, the smell rich and compelling, making your mouth water, making your stomach clench with hunger. You've eaten little today, just the morning broth and some dried berries during the midday pause, and the anticipation of the meal becomes almost overwhelming. When the meat is finally ready, distributed in portions that reflect both need and social standing, you eat with an intensity that excludes all other sensation. The food is hot, slightly charred on the outside, still pink within. The fat melts on your tongue. The substance of it fills your belly in a way that makes you realize just how empty you were. You eat until you're full, truly full, a sensation that doesn't come often. And then you sit close to the fire, letting the warmth soak into your bones. Around you, others do the same, faces flickering in the firelight, expressions soft with satisfaction and tiredness. Someone begins to tell a story, their voice low and rhythmic, speaking of another hunt seasons ago, of a winter that was harder than this one, of ancestors who faced greater cold and survived. You listen without concentrating, letting the words wash over you, becoming part of the evening's texture, along with the fire's crackle, the occasional cough, the settling of someone's weight against the ground. Your eyes grow heavy, the warmth, the full belly, the exhaustion of the day, all of it combines to pull you towards sleep. You don't fight it, simply allow yourself to drift, wrapping yourself in the sleeping furs, finding a position close enough to others to share warmth, far enough to have space to breathe. The last thing you're aware of before sleep takes you is the vastness of the sky above, visible through the shelter's opening, stars beginning to appear in the deepening darkness. The stars are impossibly numerous, a river of light spanning the blackness, more stars than you could count in a lifetime of counting. You think dimly about tomorrow, another day of similar tasks, similar struggles, similar small victories. The pattern repeats day after day, season after season, and you are held within it, neither happy nor unhappy exactly, simply living, breathing, continuing. This is what it means to be you in this time, in this place. This is the weight of days, the texture of survival, the quiet grinding repetition that fills your life from birth to death. You don't imagine it could be otherwise. This is simply life itself, the only life you know or can conceive of knowing. And yet, in the moments before sleep fully claims you, there's something else, a sense of connection so deep it lives below words. You are part of this group, woven into it, held by it. Your life is their life. Their struggles are your struggles. There is no separateness, no isolation, no possibility of being truly alone. This thought, if it is a thought, brings a certain comfort. Whatever happens, hunger, cold, injury, loss, you will face it together, surrounded by the same faces, the same voices, the same shared understanding. The hardship is immense, but it is distributed, carried collectively, never yours alone to bear. Sleep comes softly, pulling you down into darkness that is somehow less dark than it should be, always aware at some level of the fire's glow, the breathing of others, the possibility that something in the night might require you to wake. You sleep lightly, as you always do, as everyone does, because true rest is another luxury that belongs to a time not yet born. The night passes slowly, marked by periodic wakings, someone adding wood to the fire, a child crying briefly before being soothed, a dream that surfaces and dissolves without leaving clear memory. Each time you wake, you're aware of the cold that waits beyond the fire's reach, the darkness that presses close, the vast indifferent landscape spreading away in all directions. But each time, sleep reclaims you, your body demanding rest, your consciousness unable to sustain wakefulness without reason. The hours accumulate in this fragmented way, neither true sleep nor true waking, until finally the darkness begins to thin at its edges, signaling the approach of another dawn, another day, another repetition of the pattern, that defines your existence. You will wake soon, feeling the cold first, then the ache in your muscles. You will unwrap yourself from the furs reluctantly, adjust your clothing, check your tools. The fire will be coaxed back to life. The thin morning broth will be prepared. The day's tasks will be discussed and decided upon, and you will continue, as you always have, as you always will, moving through the rhythms that sustain you, carrying your share of the collective burden, finding small moments of warmth and satisfaction within the larger framework of hardship. This is your life, simple and difficult, connected and isolating, hard beyond modern imagining, and yet possessed of a coherence, a purpose, a belonging that asks nothing more than your presence, your effort, your continued survival. The question that will never occur to you because you lack the framework to even form it is whether this life is good or bad, whether you are happy or unhappy. These concepts don't exist in your world. There is only life itself, the struggle to continue, the hope for enough food, the warmth of the fire, the presence of others, the slow turning of seasons, and the vast sky overhead, indifferent and eternal. And somewhere in that simplicity, in that absence of alternatives, in that complete immersion in the present moment's demands, there might be something we've lost, a way of being that asked less of the mind and more of the body, that existed in time rather than always anticipating or remembering it, that knew connection not as a choice or an achievement, but as an inescapable condition of existence itself. But these thoughts are mine, not yours. You simply are, breathing in the cold air of another morning that is beginning to arrive, preparing to face another day identical to yesterday and the day before, and all the days stretching back to the beginning of memory when your people first came to this place, following the animals, following the seasons, following the ancient paths that have no names and need none. Let us drift now from the generalized struggle of daily life to a more specific story, a singular thread within the vast tapestry of human existence during those cold millennia. This is the story of someone whose remains were found thousands of years later, carefully laid within a cave in a mountainous region that would one day be called Iraq, in a valley where a river ran clear and cold through rocky terrain. The cave system, known to modern archaeologists as Shanidar, has yielded many secrets, many burials, many glimpses into the lives of people who lived so long ago that their world bears almost no resemblance to ours. But among these discoveries, one individual stands apart, not for his achievements in the ways we usually measure such things, but for what his very survival reveals about the nature of human care. He has been given the designation Shanidar I by those who study such things, but in his own time he had a name, sounds spoken by voices long silent, a name that meant something to those who knew him. We cannot know what that name was, cannot hear it spoken, but we can reconstruct something of his life from the evidence left behind in bone and context. Imagine him then, not as a specimen or a catalogue number, but as a person, a male individual who lived approximately 40 to 50,000 years ago, during a time when the world was in the grip of ice ages, when temperatures fluctuated dramatically, when human populations remained small and scattered. He was born into a group that dwelt seasonally in the cave system, a group that likely numbered between 20 and 40 individuals, related by blood and kinship in the complex ways that defined such communities. His birth, like all births, would have been a time of both hope and anxiety. Children were precious, but their survival was never certain. From his earliest days, it would have become apparent that something was different about him. The exact nature of his disabilities has been reconstructed from the skeletal evidence. He suffered from a crushed eye socket that likely rendered him blind in one eye, possibly from birth or from an injury sustained very young. His right arm was withered, ending in a limb that showed signs of having been amputated or severely damaged, leaving him with limited use of his upper body. Additionally, his leg showed abnormalities, suggesting he had difficulty walking, perhaps limping significantly, perhaps requiring support to move across difficult terrain. These were not minor inconveniences in a world where survival depended on physical capability, on the ability to track animals, to travel long distances, to flee from danger when necessary. In a society that operated on purely practical terms, that could not afford to support those unable to contribute to the group's survival, he should not have lived. Infants born with severe disabilities were likely left to die, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the harsh mathematics of survival when food is scarce and every mouth must be weighed against the group's collective resources. But he did not die in infancy. The bones tell us he lived into his 40s, an advanced age for his time, when most individuals did not survive past their 30s, when injury, infection, and the accumulated wear of hard living claimed people long before what we would consider old age. His survival means something profound and undeniable. People cared for him. Someone fed him when he could not feed himself. Someone protected him when he could not protect himself. Someone walked beside him when his damaged leg made walking difficult. Someone valued his existence enough to ensure he continued existing year after year, season after season, through times of plenty and times of hunger. Let us imagine a day in his life, perhaps when he was in his 30s, still alive, still part of the group's daily rhythm. The cave mouth frames a view of the valley beyond, where trees climb the slopes and the river curves through the lowland. Inside, the air is cooler, stable, carrying the smell of smoke and human habitation. He wakes with the others, though his waking is different. He cannot simply rise and begin the day's tasks. Someone, perhaps a younger relative, helps him sit up, checks that his leg hasn't stiffened too much during the night, hands him a warm stone to hold, easing the ache that lives permanently in his joints. The group prepares for a hunt, as they do most mornings when the weather permits and the season is right. The men gather their weapons, check their tools, discuss in low voices the signs they observed yesterday, tracks leading north, movement in the trees beyond the next ridge. The women who will accompany them prepare as well, collecting gathering bags, ensuring they have cutting tools, wrapping themselves against the cold. He watches this preparation with the understanding of one who knows he cannot participate. There was a time perhaps when he tried, when pride or hope led him to insist he could help, could contribute in the ways others did. But experience taught him his limitations, taught him that his presence on a hunt was more burden than benefit, that his slow pace endangered others, that his inability to see clearly from one eye and to use one arm made him a liability, when quick reaction might mean survival. So he stays. This is his role now, his contribution, to remain at the cave, to tend the fire, to watch over the youngest children and the eldest members of the group, those who, like him, cannot venture far. This is not idleness, but a form of work, valuable in its own way. As the hunting party departs, moving down the slope and disappearing into the forest, he settles himself near the fire, arranging his body to minimize the discomfort that never quite leaves him. The damaged arm rests across his lap. He has learned not to try using it, has accepted its uselessness. The damaged leg extends before him, slightly twisted, the foot turned inward in a way that makes standing for long periods painful. An elderly woman sits nearby, working at scraping a hide. She is old enough that her teeth are worn down, her joints stiff, her pace slow. But her hands remember the work, and she continues it, contributing what she can. They do not speak much. Speech in this time and place is sparse, reserved for necessary communication, for storytelling in the evenings, for the rare moments when words seem important. The morning passes in slow quietness. The fire crackles softly. A child plays near the cave mouth, arranging stones in patterns only they understand, narrating a private story in sounds that barely qualify as words. The sun climbs higher, its light moving across the cave floor as the angle changes. He thinks, in the way people think without structured language, about the shape of his life. There is no self-pity in these thoughts, no sense of tragedy. These concepts would be meaningless to him. There is only the reality of his existence, accepted because it cannot be changed, born because what alternative exists. But within that acceptance, there is also awareness and understanding that his life has been made possible by others, that his continued existence represents a choice the group made and continues to make season after season. He knows, without needing to articulate it, that he is loved, not in the romantic or sentimental sense that the word might carry in later eras, but in the fundamental sense of being valued, being included, being seen as part of the whole. When he was younger, perhaps in his 20s, he developed a role that justified his presence beyond mere sentiment. He became a keeper of memory, a repository of information that the group needed but that was difficult to encode in any permanent form. He learned to remember, to hold in his mind the locations of water sources that could be relied upon, even in drought, the patterns of animal migration that repeated with the seasons, the stories of past winters and past summers, of times when food was plentiful and times when hunger nearly destroyed the group. His memory became valuable, consulted when decisions needed to be made, drawn upon when younger members needed guidance. He could not hunt, could not gather far from camp, could not defend the group if danger came. But he could remember, and in a world without writing, without any external storage for knowledge, memory was power. The hunters return in the late afternoon, carrying the body of a young ibex they managed to bring down. It is not a large kill, but it is something, enough, to provide fresh meat for several days if rationed carefully. The group's mood lifts slightly, the baseline anxiety about food recedes for a moment. He watches the butchering process from his place by the fire, unable to help with the physical work, but able to offer quiet suggestions, where to cut to preserve the hide most effectively, how to separate the joints cleanly, which organs should be saved and which can be discarded. His knowledge, accumulated over decades of observation, makes him useful even in his immobility. That evening, as the meat cooks and darkness settles over the valley, he tells a story. This is another role he has claimed. He is the voice that carries the past into the present, that reminds the group of their continuity, their identity, their place in the long chain of generations. He tells of a winter many years ago before he was born, a winter his mother told him about when he was young. The cold came early that year and stayed late, and the animals that the group depended upon moved away, seeking better foraging grounds. The people grew thin, weak, desperate. Some died, the very young, the very old, those whose bodies could not withstand the sustained hunger. But some survived, and those survivors included his mother, and therefore his own existence was made possible by decisions made in that terrible winter, by choices to share the little food that remained, by the refusal to completely abandon hope. The story is not told for entertainment. There is no drama in his voice, no attempt to build suspense or elicit emotion. It is told simply as fact, as reminder, as context for understanding that hardship is not new, that the group has faced worse and continued. The listeners are quiet, faces flickering in the firelight, absorbing the story not as information, but as confirmation of something they already know at a deep level. That survival is uncertain, that the group's strength lies in its cohesion, that the past and present and future are connected in ways that demand respect and attention. When the story ends, there is no applause, no verbal response. The fire continues to crackle. Someone adds wood to the flames. Children are gathered and settled for sleep. The day concludes not with ceremony but with the simple cessation of activity, the gradual quieting as people arrange themselves for the night. He lies down in his usual spot, helped by the same person who helped him rise that morning. The pain in his leg is constant, a dull ache that sleep will only partially ease. But he is warm, he has eaten, he is surrounded by the presence of others. These things are enough. They have always been enough. As sleep approaches, he might think, if his consciousness moves in anything like the ways ours does, about the strange path his life has taken. In another group, under different circumstances, he would have died young. His disabilities should have been fatal, either through direct inability to survive or through the group's decision that he could not be supported. But this group chose differently. Why? We cannot know for certain. Perhaps they valued him for reasons we cannot reconstruct. Perhaps his mother was particularly important and fought for his survival. Perhaps there was simply enough surplus in those early years that his continued existence did not represent an unbearable burden. Whatever the reasons, the choice was made and remade day after day, year after year, until it became simply the reality of the group's composition. He was part of them, and they were part of him. His death, when it eventually came, would have been marked by grief. The skeletal evidence suggests he was buried with care, his body placed deliberately, possibly with flowers or symbolic objects that have not survived the millennia. This was not the burial of someone merely tolerated. This was the burial of someone valued, someone whose absence would be felt, someone who belonged. The lesson his bones teach us, speaking across the vast gulf of time, is that care is ancient. Compassion is not a modern invention, not a luxury of complex civilization, not something that appeared only when humans developed agriculture and permanent settlements and the capacity to generate surplus. Care existed here in this small group, in this cave, in this time when survival was difficult and uncertain. It existed not as exception, but as practice, woven into the daily fabric of life. The group could have survived without him. Indeed, his presence likely made certain tasks more difficult, required additional effort, represented a constant allocation of resources towards someone who could not reciprocate in kind. But they kept him alive anyway. They fed him, protected him, valued him, included him. They made a place for him in the group structure, found ways for him to contribute that matched his capabilities, adapted their expectations and their patterns to accommodate his needs. This is what his skeleton tells us. This is the message encoded in the marks of his disabilities and the evidence of his long survival. Humans in the deep past were capable of tenderness, of patience, of looking at someone who could not hunt and deciding that their life still held value, still deserved protection, still belonged within the circle of care. And perhaps, though this is speculation, though we cannot know for certain, perhaps his group was better for his presence. Perhaps his memory-keeping strengthened them. Perhaps his stories reinforced their identity. Perhaps his very existence reminded them that strength comes in many forms, that value cannot be reduced to physical capability alone. Or perhaps they simply loved him in whatever way love existed then, and that was reason enough. Perhaps the decision to keep him alive required no justification beyond the fact of his existence, beyond the recognition that he was one of them, that his life was bound to theirs, that to let him die would be to diminish something essential in themselves. We, looking back from our position of comfort and plenty, might be tempted to see his story as tragic. A life limited by disability, constrained by circumstance, marked by what he could not do rather than what he could. But this is our interpretation, not his reality. He lived the only life available to him, and within that life he found purpose, connection, and belonging. His story stands as counterpoint to the common assumption that prehistoric life was purely brutal, that early humans operated solely on survival instinct, that weakness meant abandonment and death. The reality, as his bones reveal, was more complex, more human, more recognizable to us despite the vast distance in time. The group that cared for him faced all the same pressures we have already explored: hunger, cold, danger, the endless struggle to acquire enough food to survive another day. Yet within those constraints, they found space for compassion, made room for someone whose contribution was measured not in meat brought back from the hunt, but in knowledge preserved, in stories told, in the simple fact of his continued presence. This is not sentimentality, this is evidence. The bones do not lie. He lived 4 decades, through countless seasons, through periods of plenty and scarcity, through migrations and settlements, through the ordinary catastrophes that marked life in those distant times, and he lived because others chose again and again to make that possible. His final resting place in the cave speaks to this as well. He was not discarded, not left where he fell, not treated as refuse to be cleared away. He was laid carefully in the earth, his position deliberate, his burial marking the end of a life that mattered. The earth held him as the group had held him, and there he remained through millennia of change until modern hands uncovered him and began to read the story written in his bones. That story continues to resonate because it reveals something fundamental about human nature, not the nature we aspire to, not the idealized version we present to ourselves, but the actual, embodied nature that expresses itself in action. Under conditions of genuine hardship, when resources were scarce and survival uncertain, humans still made room for care. They still valued individuals beyond their immediate utility. They still practiced something we might recognize as love. And so his life, preserved accidentally in skeletal form, becomes a window into the emotional landscape of the deep past. It suggests that the capacity for compassion is not a recent development, not a product of civilization's softening influence, but something ancient, fundamental, woven into the fabric of what it means to be human. As we drift away from his story, returning to the broader sweep of Paleolithic life, we carry this understanding with us, that behind the hardship, beneath the struggle, within the framework of survival, there existed relationships of genuine care, bonds that transcended mere utility, connections that made life bearable even when circumstances were nearly unbearable. Now let us turn toward something stranger still, something that emerges from the depths of prehistory like a whisper from the earth itself. We leave behind the individual and return to the collective, but not to the world of daily struggle. Instead, we descend into darkness, into the deep places where ancient humans went to create something that was neither tool nor shelter, neither obviously practical nor easily explained. We are going into the painted caves, those mysterious underground chambers where flickering firelight once revealed images of animals, handprints, abstract symbols, and forms that seem to hover between representation and pure imagination. These caves exist scattered across Europe, in France, in Spain, in other regions where limestone formations created natural galleries deep beneath the surface. The geography of these painted caves tells its own story, a story written in stone and shaped by water over millions of years. The limestone regions where these caves formed are themselves ancient, laid down in prehistoric seas, compressed and uplifted by tectonic forces, then carved and hollowed by the patient work of underground rivers. The caves are not uniform. Each has its own character, its own configuration of passages and chambers, its own particular challenges and atmospheres. Some require crawling through narrow tunnels barely wide enough for a human body to pass through. Others open into vast cathedral-like spaces where the ceiling disappears into darkness beyond the reach of any torch. Some are relatively dry with firm floors and stable walls, while others are wet and treacherous, with slick surfaces and sudden drops into underground pools or chasms. The locations of these caves within the landscape also vary, though certain patterns emerge. Many are positioned at elevations that would have provided strategic views of the surrounding territory, places where hunters could observe animal migrations and weather patterns. Others are tucked away in secluded valleys, hidden from casual view, requiring specific knowledge to locate. The placement seems deliberate, suggesting that accessibility, or rather, controlled inaccessibility, was part of their significance. Imagine approaching one such cave on a day perhaps 30,000 years ago, when the ice still held much of the northern world in its grip, when the landscape above was a mix of tundra and sparse forest, when the animals that would later vanish from Europe, cave lions, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer, still wandered across the cold plains. The world you inhabit is one of extremes, where summer brings brief abundance and winter demands careful rationing of resources, where the margin between survival and starvation can be measured in a few unlucky weeks of bad weather or failed hunts. You are part of a small group, perhaps 4 or 5 individuals, and you have made the deliberate choice to leave the camp, to leave the ordinary rhythms of hunting and gathering, to make this journey to the cave mouth that opens like a wound in the rocky hillside. The decision to make this journey was not taken lightly. It requires taking people away from essential tasks, using resources that could be devoted to more obviously practical purposes, accepting the risks inherent in underground exploration. You carry torches, bundles of resinous wood that will burn slowly, casting unsteady light, and small lamps made from hollowed stone filled with animal fat, with twisted moss serving as wicks. The preparation of these lighting implements required its own set of skills and knowledge, identifying the right type of wood, collecting sufficient resin, shaping the stone lamps with patient grinding, rendering animal fat to the right consistency. The tools you carry beyond the lights are equally specialized: containers of prepared pigments, implements for grinding and mixing, pieces of hide or fur that can serve as applicators, hollow bones that can function as primitive airbrushes. Each item represents accumulated knowledge, techniques refined over generations, materials gathered from various sources and brought together for this specific purpose. The entrance is narrow, requiring you to stoop, to move carefully, leaving the daylight behind with each step deeper into the earth. The psychological transition is immediate and profound. You are leaving the world of sun and wind and moving into a realm that feels fundamentally different, governed by different rules, characterized by stillness and permanence rather than change and flux. The temperature changes immediately. The cave is cooler than the outside air, but also more stable, unchanging, indifferent to the seasons that govern life above. This thermal stability is part of what makes the caves suitable for preserving images, but it also contributes to their otherworldly atmosphere, their sense of existing outside normal time. The walls close in around you and the sound of your breathing becomes louder, echoing slightly in the confined space. Every footfall is amplified, every whispered word seems to linger in the air longer than it should, bouncing off stone surfaces in patterns that can be disorienting. Water drips somewhere ahead, a patient rhythm that has continued for thousands of years before your arrival and will continue for thousands after your departure. This sound becomes a kind of meditation, a steady pulse that grounds you even as you move deeper into unfamiliar territory, a reminder that the cave itself is alive in its own slow way, still being shaped by forces that operate on geological timescales. The stone beneath your feet is slick in places, worn smooth by the passage of water and time. You must move carefully, testing each step, aware that a fall in these conditions could be serious. Broken bones heal slowly in an era without advanced medicine, and an injury that merely inconveniences a modern person could prove fatal to someone whose survival depends on physical capability. The walls bear marks of the cave's formation, ripples and flows frozen in stone, pockets and hollows where softer material has eroded away, occasional formations of calcite where mineral-rich water has deposited delicate structures over countless years. These natural features will later be incorporated into the paintings, used to suggest depth or movement, or to represent specific anatomical features of the animals being depicted. You move deeper, following passages that twist and descend, occasionally opening into larger chambers before narrowing again. The route is not straight, not obvious. Reaching the painting chambers requires navigating a three-dimensional maze, making choices at intersections, remembering landmarks in a landscape where everything is stone and shadow. The torchlight creates moving shadows, makes the rock walls seem to breathe and shift. This flickering illumination is itself part of the experience. The animals that will be painted here will be viewed in similar light, and the painters work with this quality of illumination in mind, knowing that their images will seem to move and come alive when seen by firelight. Your companions move quietly with a sense of purpose that suggests this is not casual exploration but something closer to pilgrimage, to ritual, to an act that carries weight and meaning. The silence is not uncomfortable but rather expectant, charged with anticipation, as if the group is preparing itself mentally and emotionally for what is to come. There may be preparatory rituals that precede entry into the deepest chambers, periods of fasting, prayers or invocations, the application of ochre or other pigments to bodies or faces, the playing of simple instruments made from bone or hollowed wood. These preparations would serve to mark the transition from ordinary consciousness to the heightened awareness appropriate for sacred work. Eventually, you reach a chamber, not the largest in the cave system, but one that has been chosen for reasons that may never be fully understood. The selection of particular chambers for painting, while others remain unmarked, suggests sophisticated criteria, perhaps based on acoustic properties, on the quality of the rock surface, on the configuration of natural features, or on factors we cannot begin to guess at. The ceiling rises above you, disappearing into darkness that the torchlight cannot fully penetrate. This sense of vast space overhead creates its own psychological effect, a feeling of being in a place that dwarfs human scale, that reduces individual presence to something small and temporary against the permanence of stone. The walls curve around in irregular patterns, and the stone here has a particular quality, a slight roughness that will hold pigment when it is applied. The painters have learned through experience which surfaces will accept their materials and which will not, which textures will allow for fine detail, and which will better suit bold, simple forms. One of your companions begins to prepare materials, chunks of ochre ranging in color from deep red to yellow-orange, collected from deposits that might be days of travel from this location. The ochre itself is ancient, formed from iron oxide deposits created by processes that predate human existence by unimaginable spans of time, now being put to use in creating images that will outlast the painters by equally vast periods. Another crushes charcoal into fine powder, mixing it with fat to create a black paste that can be applied to the stone. The charcoal must be prepared carefully. Too coarse, and it will not adhere properly. Too fine, and it may disperse unevenly, the right consistency achieved through experience and practiced judgment. A third prepares what might be manganese dioxide, which will create marks of deep purple-black. This material has different properties than charcoal, creating lines and marks with their own distinctive character, useful for particular effects and details. The range of available colors is limited but sufficient: reds, yellows, oranges from ochre, blacks from charcoal and manganese, occasionally whites from kaolin or calcite. Within these constraints, the painters will create images of remarkable subtlety and power, proving that artistic expression depends less on extensive materials than on skill and vision. There is no discussion of what will be painted, no debate about subject or composition. This has been decided elsewhere, or perhaps it emerges organically from the painter's mind, or perhaps it follows patterns established long ago, patterns that have been maintained and transmitted across generations. The knowledge of what to paint and how to paint it may be held by specific individuals, perhaps shamans or ritual specialists, perhaps particularly talented artists whose abilities have been recognized and cultivated, perhaps elders who have learned through long apprenticeship and now teach the next generation. This suggests a level of social complexity that contradicts simplistic notions of prehistoric life as purely egalitarian or purely survival-focused. The painting begins. A figure approaches the wall holding a torch close to illuminate a specific section of stone, adjusting the angle and distance to provide the painter with optimal visibility while avoiding smoke damage to the surface being worked on. Another figure begins to apply the pigment, not with a brush, there are no brushes, but with fingers, with small pieces of fur or hide, with tools made from hollow bones that can be used to blow pigment across the surface, creating soft transitions and subtle gradations of tone. Each application method produces distinctive effects, and skilled painters know which technique to employ for each aspect of an image. The first image to emerge from the darkness is an animal, perhaps a horse, its form suggested with remarkable economy of line, the curve of the back capturing the essential character of the species with minimal detail. This economy is not a limitation but a choice, a sophisticated understanding that art need not replicate every detail of reality to convey essential truth about its subject. The pigment goes on in layers, building gradually, and the uneven surface of the rock itself becomes part of the image, a natural bulge in the stone suggesting the swell of the animal's shoulder. This integration of natural features demonstrates the painter's deep observation of their canvas, their ability to see potential images in the configurations of rock before any pigment is applied. Time passes strangely in the cave. There is no sun to mark its passage, no external reference to ground you in the normal flow of hours. The human circadian rhythm begins to drift in the absence of light cues, creating a sense of existing outside normal time in an eternal present where past and future lose some of their distinctness. You might be here for a portion of a day, or you might be here for several days, emerging only to eat and rest before returning to continue the work. The extended periods of focus and concentration required for complex paintings suggest that the painters entered states of consciousness different from everyday awareness, perhaps approaching what modern people would recognize as meditative or trance states. The cave exists outside of time, in its own sustained present. This timelessness may be part of its power, part of what makes it suitable for creating images intended to endure, to speak across generations, to connect present with past and future in ways that ordinary spaces cannot. More animals appear on the walls as the work continues, bison with their massive heads lowered, their horns curving back along their skulls, their bodies rendered in quick, sure strokes that suggest deep familiarity with the living animals. The painters know these creatures intimately, have tracked them, hunted them, butchered them, used every part of their bodies for food, clothing, tools, and shelter. This practical knowledge informs the artistic representation, creating images that capture not just physical appearance but essential character, the weight and power and presence of the living animal. Aurochs standing in profile, their proportions slightly elongated, their presence somehow more than mere representation. The slight stylization suggests that these are not simply portraits but something more symbolic. Animals as they exist in imagination or belief, rather than only as they appear to the physical eye. Deer with elaborate antlers, their legs positioned as if caught mid-stride. The depiction of movement in a static medium shows sophisticated understanding of how the brain interprets visual information, how to suggest motion through the positioning of limbs and the implied trajectory of the body. But the animals are not the only marks on the walls. There are geometric forms as well. Dots arranged in patterns, lines that curve and intersect, grids of small marks whose meaning is opaque, resistant to interpretation, even by modern researchers, armed with statistical analysis and ethnographic comparisons. These abstract symbols appear alongside the animal figures, sometimes overlapping them, creating a palimpsest of meaning that resists simple interpretation. The relationship between these geometric forms and the animal images remains one of the great mysteries of cave art. Are they calendrical notations, astronomical observations, counting systems, purely decorative elements, or something else entirely? Some researchers have proposed that the geometric forms represent entoptic phenomena, visual patterns that emerge from the structure of the human nervous system itself, particularly visible during altered states of consciousness. If correct, this would suggest that the cave paintings document visionary experiences, journeys into non-ordinary awareness undertaken for purposes we can only guess at. And there are hands. This might be the strangest element, the most directly personal, negative handprints created by placing a hand flat against the rock and blowing pigment around it, leaving the hand silhouette pale against the colored background. The technique is simple but effective, requiring no special artistic skill, allowing anyone to leave a mark regardless of their ability to draw or paint. This democratizing aspect suggests that handprinting may have served different purposes than the animal imagery, perhaps allowing broader participation in the cave's sacred or communal functions. Dozens of hands, perhaps hundreds, across all the painted caves, hands belonging to adults and children, mostly left hands, suggesting right-handed individuals holding the pigment in their dominant hand while pressing their other hand to the stone. Statistical analysis of these handprints has revealed much about the cave visitors, their approximate ages, their sex, in some cases, their relative proportions within the groups that used the caves. Some handprints show missing fingers, whether from injury, from intentional amputation as part of ritual practice, or from genetic conditions remains a matter of debate. These incomplete hands add another layer of mystery, suggesting that physical marking of the body may have accompanied the marking of the cave walls, that people carried on their own flesh signs of their participation in these underground activities. These hands speak across the millennia with an intimacy that the animal figures do not quite achieve. This is direct contact, skin against stone, the exact shape and size of a specific individual preserved in pigment, a person reaching out through time to touch us in ways that feel almost immediate. A person stood here, pressed their hand to this wall, and left this mark. We can place our own hand over theirs and feel the connection across 30,000 years, can match our fingers to theirs, and realize that despite the vast gulf of time and culture, we share this basic physiology, this five-fingered hand that has served humanity for all of our existence. The purpose of all this remains mysterious. Modern humans encountering these caves for the first time in the 19th and 20th centuries brought their own assumptions and interpretations, viewing the paintings through the lens of their own cultures and preconceptions. Surely this was art, created for aesthetic reasons, representing the birth of human creativity and symbolic thought. This interpretation emerged from European artistic traditions that valued visual representation and saw the cave paintings as primitive precursors to classical and modern art, the first stirrings of the aesthetic impulse that would eventually produce the masterworks of Western civilization. Or surely this was religious, part of shamanic rituals, attempts to control the animals through sympathetic magic. This interpretation drew on ethnographic parallels with indigenous cultures around the world, where visual representation often serves spiritual purposes, where images are not merely decorative but actively powerful, capable of affecting the world through symbolic means. Or surely this was educational, teaching spaces where young hunters learned to recognize and understand the prey species they would pursue. This functionalist interpretation emphasized the practical aspects of the paintings, seeing them as serving obvious survival purposes, transmitting essential knowledge from generation to generation in a society without writing or other means of recording information. Perhaps it was all of these things, perhaps it was none of them, or perhaps different caves served different functions, or perhaps a single cave served multiple functions simultaneously or sequentially over time. Perhaps the purpose varied from cave to cave, from painter to painter, from era to era across the thousands of years during which these images were created and revisited and added to. The assumption that all painted caves must share a single purpose may itself be a modern projection, imposing artificial unity onto practices that were actually diverse and locally determined. Perhaps asking about purpose in the singular is the wrong question, imposing modern categories onto practices that operated according to entirely different logic. The paintings may have been simultaneously practical and sacred, educational and artistic, communal and individual, serving purposes that our contemporary frameworks cannot easily accommodate. What we can say with certainty is that this activity was important enough to justify the effort it required. Reaching these deep chambers meant traveling in darkness, navigating difficult passages, spending extended periods away from the ordinary business of survival, accepting real dangers and discomforts for outcomes that were not materially productive in any obvious way. Acquiring and preparing the pigments required knowledge, planning, and significant investment of time and energy. The ochre deposits might be located days of travel from the painted caves, requiring expeditions specifically to obtain these materials, suggesting that the creation of the paintings was planned well in advance rather than spontaneous. The painting itself demanded skill, patience, and a kind of sustained attention that presupposes both talent and training. The best cave paintings show technical mastery that could only come from extensive practice, suggesting that some individuals specialized in this work, developing their abilities over years or decades, perhaps teaching apprentices in turn. These were not casual doodles, not idle marks made to pass time. These were intentional creations made with care and purpose in locations that were deliberately chosen for their remoteness, their isolation, their separation from the lit world above. The very difficulty of accessing these chambers suggests they were sacred spaces, set apart from ordinary life, requiring some kind of preparation or permission or ritual purity before entry was permitted. Not everyone may have been allowed into the deepest chambers. Access might have been restricted by age, by sex, by social status, by initiation into specific groups or societies, by demonstration of particular qualities or completion of particular trials. Imagine standing in such a space, your torch casting uncertain light across the painted walls, the darkness pressing close beyond the small sphere of illumination. The sensory environment is profoundly different from anything experienced in the world above. The silence is nearly complete except for the sounds you and your companions make. The air is still and cool. The darkness is absolute beyond the reach of your light. The animals seem to move in the flickering light, their forms emerging from and receding into the stone, never quite stable, never quite fixed. This apparent animation is not accidental. The painters understood how their images would be seen, designed them to work in precisely these conditions of uncertain, moving light, creating effects that would be impossible in steady illumination. The handprints surround you, silent witnesses to other presences, other moments of contact between human and stone. Each hand represents an individual story, a particular person who stood in this spot, who breathed this air, who participated in whatever rituals or activities occurred here, who has been dead for hundreds or thousands of years, but whose presence remains inscribed in pigment. There is something profoundly moving about these spaces, something that affects even modern visitors who approach them with cameras and scientific instruments and scholarly theories. The emotional impact of the painted caves is reported consistently by researchers and tourists alike, a sense of awe, of connection, of encountering something that transcends ordinary experience. Standing in the presence of these ancient images creates a sense of connection that transcends analysis, that operates at a level below conscious thought. We may not understand the purposes or beliefs that motivated the original painters, but we can respond to the images directly, recognizing in them the work of minds like our own, consciousnesses grappling with meaning and representation, and the desire to make marks that endure. These were made by people who lived and died thousands of years ago, people who looked at the same animals we know only from fossils, people who breathed this same underground air and felt this same sense of separation from the world above. Despite the vast differences in material culture and daily life, the fundamental humanity is unmistakable. The same drives toward creation, toward meaning-making, toward leaving traces of existence that will outlast individual lifetimes. The images themselves resist easy interpretation. Some animals appear wounded with marks that might represent spears piercing their sides, suggesting hunting magic, attempts to ensure success in the actual hunt by symbolically killing the animal in paint first, establishing control in the realm of images that would then manifest in the realm of physical reality. But many animals show no such marks. They simply stand or walk or graze, apparently undisturbed, their presence on the wall sufficient unto itself. These unmarked animals complicate the hunting magic theory, suggesting that whatever purposes the painting served were more complex than simple sympathetic magic. That representation itself may have held significance independent of any desired outcome in the physical world. Some chambers contain only certain species, rooms of horses, rooms of bison, rooms of deer, while others mix species together in compositions that might be naturalistic or might be symbolic, arranging animals according to logic we cannot retrieve. The organization of images within and across chambers suggests systematic thinking, possibly based on beliefs about relationships between species, or about the cosmos, or about human social structures being represented through animal forms. The geometric signs appear with varying frequency, sometimes densely clustered, sometimes occurring as isolated marks, their relationship to the animal figures uncertain. Recent research has begun to identify regional patterns in these signs, with certain forms appearing more frequently in particular geographical areas, suggesting that they may represent different groups or traditions, possibly even proto-writing systems encoding specific information. Occasionally there are human figures, though these are rare and often highly stylized, barely recognizable as human at all. When humans do appear, they tend to be fragmentary, partial, ambiguous, stick figures rather than naturalistic representations, or figures with animal characteristics blurring the boundary between human and beast. It is as if the painters were comfortable representing the non-human world with precision and care, but became uncertain when attempting to depict their own species. This reluctance may reflect taboos against human representation or belief systems in which humans held uncertain status, neither fully animal nor fully separate from the animal world, or perhaps the sense that human form was too sacred or too powerful to render casually. One of the most intriguing aspects of these caves is their duration of use. Dating techniques have revealed that some caves were visited and painted over periods of thousands of years, with new images added to old ones, creating layered compositions where earlier paintings show through later ones, sometimes in ways that seem deliberately interactive, later painters responding to earlier images, creating dialogues across centuries. This suggests these were not one-time ritual spaces, but locations that held meaning across countless generations, places that groups returned to repeatedly, maintaining a continuous tradition of image-making that spanned time periods longer than our entire recorded history. The persistence of these practices across such vast spans of time indicates that they served fundamental human needs, that whatever purposes they fulfilled were not ephemeral or culturally specific, but deeply rooted in human consciousness. What was transmitted across those generations? Certainly the practical knowledge of how to make and apply pigments, how to use the uneven stone surface to enhance the images, how to create the visual effects that make the animals seem alive, how to navigate the dangerous passages to reach the painting chambers safely. But perhaps also something less tangible, beliefs about the animals, about the relationship between image and reality, about the power or meaning or necessity of creating these marks in these hidden places. The transmission of these intangible aspects would have required sustained contact between generations, apprenticeship systems, or initiation rites that passed knowledge from old to young, maintaining continuity even as specific individuals came and went. The painters also left other marks of their presence beyond the images themselves. There are footprints preserved in the soft cave floor, prints belonging to children and adults, showing where they walked and stood, revealing that entire families or groups sometimes entered the caves together, that children were not necessarily excluded from these underground activities. These footprints can be analyzed to determine approximate ages, gaits, walking speeds, allowing researchers to reconstruct specific moments, a child running ahead while adults moved more slowly, a group gathered in a circle as if for a ritual or meeting, an individual standing alone before a painted wall. Each footprint is a tiny narrative, a frozen moment of ancient behavior that supplements the story told by the paintings themselves. There are marks in the clay-like material of certain cave walls, finger tracings creating abstract patterns, perhaps made while waiting for pigments to dry, perhaps serving some purpose of their own. These marks include meanders, spirals, parallel lines, cross-hatching, patterns that appear to be simultaneously playful and deliberate, suggesting activities that ranged from casual doodling to focused pattern making. Some researchers believe these finger tracings may be the earliest human marks in some caves, predating the painted images, suggesting that the caves were first explored and marked in simple ways before the more elaborate painting traditions began. If so, the tracings represent first contacts, initial human responses to these underground spaces, test marks that preceded the development of full painting programs. In some caves, there are small sculptures as well, animals carved from stone or molded from clay, placed on natural ledges or in niches. These three-dimensional works add another layer to the question of purpose, suggesting that the transformation of stone into animal form held significance beyond the practical, beyond the merely decorative, that the impulse toward representation manifested in multiple media. The clay sculptures in particular are haunting. Some were clearly worked with great care, creating recognizable animal forms with remarkable precision given the material and tools available. Others are more schematic, suggesting forms rather than depicting them in detail. Some appear deliberately destroyed or damaged, possibly as part of ritual activities, possibly simply through the passage of time. The acoustic properties of some painted chambers have led to speculation that sound played a role in whatever activities occurred in these spaces. Certain locations produce unusual echoes or resonances, with some frequencies being amplified while others are dampened, creating auditory environments that would have been immediately apparent to the ancient visitors. It is possible that singing, chanting, or the playing of bone flutes accompanied the creation or viewing of the images. Archaeological evidence confirms that musical instruments existed in this period. Bone flutes capable of producing clear notes have been found, along with what appear to be percussion instruments made from mammoth bones. The combination of visual and auditory stimulation in the darkness, with consciousness already altered by the strangeness of the environment, and perhaps by intentional fasting or sleep deprivation, might have produced powerful psychological effects. Modern research on sensory deprivation and altered states has shown that the human brain responds in specific ways to unusual sensory environments, sometimes producing hallucinations or visions, sometimes entering trance states that feel profoundly significant to the experiencer. We know from the archaeological record that these cave painters also created portable art, small carved figures, decorated tools, engraved bones depicting animals or abstract patterns. These portable pieces could be carried, traded, given as gifts, used to transmit ideas or stories across distances, serving as physical tokens of connections between groups separated by geography. The cave paintings represent a different impulse, the desire to create something permanent, fixed in place, accessible only to those willing to make the journey into darkness. This distinction between portable and fixed art suggests different purposes and different meanings, with cave paintings perhaps serving more communal or sacred functions, while portable art facilitated individual possession and exchange. As your time in the chamber draws to a close, as the work is completed or the available light begins to fail, you prepare to leave. The sense of completion is both satisfying and melancholy. You have participated in something significant, added to a tradition that extends backwards and forwards in time, but now the moment is passing, the experience ending. The painted animals remain behind, invisible now in the darkness, waiting for the next torch-bearing visitor who might come tomorrow or might come 100 years hence. Their existence, independent of observers, is part of their power. They do not require an audience to exist, will continue to mark the cave walls whether anyone sees them or not, possess a kind of permanence that living animals lack. The cave will preserve them, the stable temperature and humidity protecting the pigments, the isolation from light preventing fading, the sealed environment keeping the images safe from weather and time. The conditions that make the caves uncomfortable for human habitation, the darkness, the cold, the isolation, are precisely what allow them to function as time capsules, preserving materials that would quickly decay in the world above. You emerge from the cave mouth into daylight that seems impossibly bright after hours in the darkness. Your eyes adjust slowly, the world above gradually coming back into focus. Trees, sky, clouds, the ordinary landscape that suddenly seems slightly strange, slightly less real than the painted world you have just left behind. This moment of transition is jarring, a crossing of thresholds that makes both worlds seem temporarily uncertain. The ordinary landscape has not changed, but your perception of it has been altered by the time spent underground, by the intense focus required in the painting chamber, by the psychological effects of operating in such an unusual environment. The journey back to camp is quiet, reflective. The experience of the cave has affected you in ways you do not fully understand, creating a sense of having participated in something significant, something that connects you to the past and to the future, something that exists outside the immediate concerns of food and shelter and survival. Your companions seem similarly affected, moving with a kind of contemplative absorption, perhaps replaying the experience in memory, perhaps already beginning to interpret and understand what occurred. The shared experience creates bonds between participants, marks them as having crossed a threshold together, as possessing knowledge or experience that others in the group may not share. The painted caves were a second world, a world of images and symbols, a world where humans and animals existed in forms that were both more and less than their physical counterparts, a world accessible only through deliberate effort and only to those who knew the way. This parallelism between the ordinary world and the painted world suggests sophisticated metaphysical thinking, the ability to conceive of and move between different planes or levels of reality. This second world coexisted with the ordinary world, neither replacing it nor being entirely separate from it, creating a dimension of experience that was neither purely practical nor purely symbolic, but something in between. The relationship between these two worlds may have been understood in terms we would now call religious or spiritual, but it may equally have been conceived in completely different frameworks that we lack the conceptual tools to comprehend. And perhaps this is part of what it means to be human, the drive to create these second worlds, these spaces of meaning and representation, these places where the imagination can operate according to its own rules, unconstrained by the immediate demands of survival. The capacity for symbolic thought, for creating and inhabiting worlds of imagination, appears to be a defining characteristic of our species, emerging early and persisting across all known cultures. The cave painters were not primitive in any meaningful sense. They were fully human, possessed of the same cognitive capacities we have, the same emotional range, the same hunger for meaning and beauty and connection. The archaeological evidence increasingly supports the view that Upper Paleolithic humans were intellectually identical to modern humans, that the difference lies not in mental capacity, but in accumulated cultural knowledge and technological development. Their world was harder than ours in almost every material respect, but it was not impoverished. It was rich with skill, with knowledge, with artistic achievement, with spiritual or ritual practices that clearly held deep significance, with social structures complex enough to organize group activities and transmit traditions across generations. The paintings are not crude, first attempts at art, but sophisticated, confident works created by people who understood their materials and their subjects with intimate precision. Technical analysis reveals the skill involved, the choice of pigments for their stability and color properties, the use of natural features to enhance compositions, the understanding of how images would appear in flickering light, the ability to capture essential character with minimal marks. As we drift away from the painted darkness, carrying with us the memory of those animal forms emerging from stone, those handprints reaching across time, those geometric symbols whose meaning remains locked in the past, we might reflect on what has been lost, along with what has been gained in the long journey from then to now. The calculation is not simple. We have gained enormously in material comfort and security, but certain kinds of knowledge and experience have receded from common human life. We have gained comfort, security, knowledge, and years of life. Modern medicine, agriculture, technology, and social organization have freed us from many of the dangers and hardships that characterized prehistoric existence, have allowed most people in developed societies to live longer, healthier, more comfortable lives than any previous generation in human history. But we have lost some immediate connection to the natural world, some sense of the sacred that could be accessed by descending into the earth, some capacity to create meaning through images painted by firelight in the silent dark. The trade-offs are real. We live in climate-controlled buildings rather than following animal migrations. We work at abstract tasks rather than engaging directly with the material world. We experience nature as leisure rather than as the fabric of daily existence. The relationship most modern humans have with animals is profoundly different from that of the cave painters. We see animals in zoos or on screens rather than tracking them for days. We buy packaged meat rather than hunting and butchering prey. We live in environments designed to exclude the non-human rather than in constant negotiation with other species. This distance may impoverish us in ways we barely recognize, cutting us off from kinds of knowledge and experience that were once universal to human life. The caves remain, those that have been discovered and those that still wait to be found, holding their secrets, preserving their images, standing as testament to the complexity and depth of human consciousness, even in the deepest past. Each discovery of a new painted cave expands our understanding slightly, reveals new variations in technique or subject matter, raises new questions about the people who created these works. They remind us that our ancestors were not lesser versions of ourselves, but fully realized human beings, facing their own challenges, creating their own meanings, leaving marks that still have the power to move us, to puzzle us, to connect us to the long chain of human existence that stretches back to the edge of time itself. Standing before these ancient images, we recognize ourselves, not in the specifics of culture or belief, but in the fundamental impulse toward creation, toward meaning, toward leaving traces that will outlast individual lives and connect generations across the gulf of years. Let us turn now to a final aspect of Paleolithic life, one that requires us to think carefully about concepts that might not have existed in the forms we recognize, but which nonetheless shape the experience of living in those distant times. We have explored the hardship of daily survival, witnessed the care extended to vulnerable individuals, descended into the mystery of the painted caves. Now we consider the question of hierarchy, of status, of the ways in which some individuals came to hold more influence than others, even in societies that lacked the formal structures of power that would emerge later. The Paleolithic world knew no kings, no priests with institutional authority, no permanent class divisions, no inherited wealth that could be passed from generation to generation. There were no palaces, no temples, no administrative centers where power concentrated and decisions were made on behalf of large populations. The scale was too small, the groups too mobile, the resources too uncertain to support such developments. And yet, within the small bands that constituted the entire social world for Paleolithic humans, distinctions existed. Not all individuals held equal influence. Not all voices carried the same weight when decisions needed to be made. Not all people enjoyed the same status or commanded the same respect. These distinctions were subtle, fluid, personal, rather than institutional, but they were real nonetheless. Consider the shaman, the ritual specialist, the person who held knowledge that others needed but could not easily access themselves. In various Paleolithic groups, certain individuals came to be seen as mediators between the visible world and the invisible forces that shaped events, the spirits of animals, the powers that controlled weather and fertility, the ancestors who had passed into the realm beyond death. These individuals were not priests in any formal sense. They held no office, commanded no hierarchy, derived their authority not from institution, but from personal power, from demonstrated ability to heal, to divine, to communicate with forces others could not perceive. Their status was real but conditional, dependent on continued proof of their special knowledge and capabilities. Imagine such a person, perhaps a woman in her 40s, who has gradually accumulated a reputation for understanding the use of plants in healing, for entering trance states during which she claims to travel to other realms, for knowing when to move camp and when to stay, for sensing the presence of game animals before physical evidence appears. Her knowledge comes partly from training. She learned from an older shaman who recognized something in her as a child, who taught her the songs and techniques and practices that would allow her to access altered states of consciousness. But her knowledge also comes from experience, from years of observation, from a particular sensitivity to patterns that others miss. She knows which plants can bring fever down, which can ease pain, which can induce vomiting to purge poison from the body. She knows how to prepare these plants, how much to use when they are most potent. This knowledge is practical and valuable, literally life-saving in a world where infection and injury are common. But she also knows other things less clearly practical, things that exist in the realm of belief and interpretation. She knows how to enter trance through drumming, through dancing, through fasting, through the consumption of certain plants that alter perception. In these altered states, she experiences visions, encounters with animal spirits, journeys to the underworld, communications with ancestors. Whether these experiences are real in any objective sense is beside the point. They are real to her, and they are real to the group that depends on her interpretations. When someone falls ill, she is consulted. She might perform a healing ritual, singing over the patient, applying poultices, sucking symbolically at the site of pain to draw out the evil. Her treatments combine practical medical knowledge with ritual performance, the two aspects so intertwined that separating them would be impossible. The group believes she has power, and that belief itself becomes a form of power, shaping outcomes through mechanisms we might now call placebo effects, but which in that context was simply part of how healing occurred. Her status in the group is complicated. She is respected, feared, needed, but also somewhat isolated. Her special knowledge sets her apart, makes her different from others, creates a distance that can never be fully bridged. She does not participate in all the normal activities. Her role exempts her from certain kinds of work, allowing her to focus on her specialized knowledge. This creates both privilege and burden. She has more freedom than others in some ways, but she also carries greater responsibility, and her failures are more visible and consequential. When she dies, her knowledge dies with her, unless she has successfully trained a successor. There is no written text to preserve her understanding of plants and rituals, no institution that continues regardless of individual lives. The transmission of shamanic knowledge is personal, fragile, always at risk of being lost if circumstances prevent proper training from occurring. Another form of status belonged to the master hunter, the individual whose skill in tracking and killing animals made them invaluable to the group's survival. Such a person, usually male, though not exclusively, earned respect through demonstrated competence, through the accumulated proof of many successful hunts, through the judgment that allowed them to decide when to pursue and when to withdraw, when to take risks and when to conserve energy. Imagine a man in his 30s, still physically strong, possessed of patience and observational acuity that sets him apart from others. He can read tracks that others miss, can interpret the behavior of animals with uncanny accuracy, can predict where game will be found based on subtle signs, the direction of the wind, the time of year, the condition of vegetation. His knowledge, like the shaman's, is partly taught and partly innate, a combination of training and natural talent that cannot be easily replicated. When a hunting party forms, he is expected to participate, to guide, to make the crucial decisions that might mean the difference between a successful kill and a wasted day of effort. His status is tied directly to his continued competence. A series of failed hunts would erode his reputation, would transfer respect and authority to others whose skills were proving more reliable. But while he is successful, his influence extends beyond the hunt itself. His opinion carries weight in other decisions: when to move camp, which direction to travel, how to respond to signs of other human groups in the territory. This influence is informal, exercised through suggestion rather than command, but it is real nonetheless. He does not hoard the results of successful hunts. The meat he helps bring down is distributed according to need and social obligation, with portions going to elders, to mothers with young children, to others who cannot hunt themselves. He might receive a slightly larger share or first choice of the best parts, but the differences are modest. His reward is primarily social: respect, influence, the satisfaction of being valued by the group. Like the shaman, his status is not inherited. His children may or may not develop similar skills, and even if they do, they must prove themselves independently. There is no automatic transfer of authority from one generation to the next. Each individual must establish their own position within the group's social structure through their own abilities and actions. The elders constitute another category of influential individuals, those who have survived long enough to accumulate decades of memory, of experience, of witnessed events that younger members of the group cannot remember. An elder who has lived 40 or 50 years has weathered many seasons, has seen patterns repeat, has learned which strategies work and which fail. Such individuals become living libraries, repositories of information that the group needs but cannot store in any external form. They remember the great drought 15 years ago, the winter when the river froze solid, the summer when game was so plentiful that meat had to be dried and stored. They remember which water sources can be trusted, which valleys flood during spring melt, which paths through the mountains are passable at different times of year. Their physical capabilities have declined. They can no longer hunt effectively, can no longer travel long distances without difficulty, can no longer perform the hardest physical labor. But their knowledge makes them valuable nonetheless, worth the extra effort required to help them keep pace with the group's movements, worth the additional food needed to sustain them. An elder's influence operates through counsel rather than command. When decisions need to be made, when the group faces uncertainty, the elders are consulted. Their memories provide context, offer precedents, remind others of what happened the last time similar circumstances occurred. This role is neither formal nor guaranteed. Elders who prove consistently wrong, whose memories are unreliable, who cannot adapt their thinking to new situations, gradually lose influence even as they retain basic respect. These various forms of status, the shaman's spiritual authority, the master hunter's practical skill, the elder's accumulated memory, represent the closest thing to hierarchy that existed in Paleolithic societies. But it is crucial to understand how different this was from the hierarchies that would develop later, once humans began to practice agriculture, to accumulate surplus, to establish permanent settlements. Paleolithic status was personal rather than institutional. It was earned rather than inherited. It was conditional rather than permanent. It conferred influence rather than power in the coercive sense. And most importantly, it existed within groups so small that face-to-face relationships, personal knowledge of every individual, and the practical necessity of cooperation prevented the emergence of true domination. No Paleolithic leader could compel obedience. There was no mechanism for enforcement, no specialized force that could impose the leader's will on unwilling followers. If enough people disagreed with a particular individual's decisions, they could simply leave, could form a new group, could vote with their feet. This possibility constrained even the most influential individuals, forcing them to maintain consensus, to consider others' needs and opinions, to lead through persuasion rather than command. The resources available to Paleolithic groups could not be monopolized. Food had to be consumed relatively quickly. It could not be stored indefinitely, could not accumulate into wealth that one person controlled. Territory was vast relative to human population, preventing any group from claiming exclusive ownership of regions large enough to support them. Tools and weapons were simple enough that anyone with training could make them. There was no specialization so advanced that it created dependency. This meant that inequality, while present, remained modest. The shaman might have slightly better access to certain resources, might be exempted from certain forms of labor, might enjoy greater respect. But she still lived in the same basic conditions as everyone else, still faced the same cold and hunger and danger, still depended on the group's collective success for her own survival. The master hunter might receive marginal privileges, might have first choice of certain items, might exercise greater influence in decision-making, but he could not command others to hunt on his behalf, could not claim ownership of game animals before they were killed, could not pass his status to his children, regardless of their actual abilities. The elders were cared for and respected, but they were also burdens in practical terms, slower to move, requiring assistance, consuming resources without producing them. Their status reflected the value placed on knowledge and continuity, but it did not exempt them from the basic vulnerabilities of age and physical decline. In comparing this social structure to our own, certain contrasts become stark and illuminating. Paleolithic humans lived without bosses, without landlords, without bureaucrats, without police, without courts, without prisons, without any of the institutional mechanisms through which power is exercised in complex societies. They lived without rent, without debt, without the anxiety of uncertain employment, without the fear of homelessness or destitution. Their material possessions were minimal, what they could carry, what they could make from available materials, what served clear practical purposes. They accumulated nothing, stored nothing long-term, owned nothing that could become a source of wealth or power. In some fundamental sense, they were free from the weight of things, from the burden of property, from the endless acquisition and maintenance that characterizes modern life. Their working hours, by contemporary standards, were modest. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, imperfect analogues but our best available reference, suggest that obtaining food, and maintaining basic survival requirements took somewhere between 20 and 30 hours per week. The rest of the time was available for rest, for social interaction, for storytelling, for play, for the manufacture of non-essential items, for simply being. Children in Paleolithic societies grew up with extraordinary freedom by modern standards. They were not confined to homes or schools, not subjected to rigid schedules or intensive supervision, not pressured to achieve or compete or prepare for distant future roles. They learned through play, through observation, through gradual participation in adult activities as their capabilities developed. They were held within the constant presence of the group, surrounded by adults and other children, never isolated, never left alone. The emotional security this provided was profound. No Paleolithic child worried about being abandoned, about not having enough to eat, except when the entire group faced scarcity, about failing to meet expectations, about being bullied without adult intervention. The group was small enough that every child was known, was included, was valued simply by virtue of being part of the whole. Adults, too, lived within this constant social context. There was no loneliness in the modern sense, no possibility of spending days without human contact, no experience of living alone in separate dwellings cut off from others. The lack of privacy that this entailed had its costs, but it also provided a kind of belonging, a depth of connection that many modern people never experience despite being surrounded by millions of others in cities. The spiritual or ritual life of Paleolithic groups, glimpsed through cave art and burial practices and the traces of shamanic activity, suggests a world where the boundary between mundane and sacred was more permeable than in later times. The spirits that animated the world were not distant gods requiring intermediaries and elaborate institutions, but immediate presences, accessible through relatively simple rituals, responsive to human attention. There was no separation between religious life and ordinary life, no need to attend services or make pilgrimages or maintain elaborate observances. The sacred was woven into the everyday, in the treatment of animal remains, in the telling of stories, in the respect shown to certain locations, in the altered states accessed by shamans. This integration meant that meaning was constantly available, constantly reinforced, never requiring the leap of faith that characterizes religions in societies where the sacred has been separated from the everyday and confined to specialized spaces and times. And yet, with all these apparent advantages, with all the ways in which Paleolithic life might seem preferable to our own, the freedom from hierarchy, the modest working hours, the deep social connection, the integration of meaning into daily life, we must not romanticize or oversimplify. The suffering was real, the physical hardship was constant, the vulnerability to injury, infection, predation, and starvation was immense. Paleolithic humans lived shorter lives on average than we do, died of causes we would consider trivial, endured pain we could easily alleviate, watched children die with far greater frequency than we can imagine. Their lives were lived close to the edge, always aware that circumstances could shift suddenly, that fortune could abandon them, that death was never far away. The question then is not whether they had it better or worse than us in some absolute sense. Such comparisons are ultimately impossible across such vast differences in circumstance. The question is what we might learn from the comparison, what insights emerge from considering how human life was organized when the material conditions were so different from our own. What becomes clear is that many of the structures we consider natural or inevitable, hierarchy, property, specialization, the separation of work from leisure, the isolation of individuals and nuclear families from broader social networks, are not human universals but rather contingent developments that emerged under specific conditions. Humans lived for tens of thousands of years without these structures, organized in ways that met their needs and allowed for the full expression of human cognitive and emotional capabilities. The painted caves speak to this. They demonstrate artistic sophistication, abstract thinking, symbolic representation, all the markers of behavioral modernity. The care given to disabled individuals speaks to it as well. The capacity for compassion, for valuing life beyond utility, for maintaining social bonds, even at cost. The modest hierarchy speaks to it too, the possibility of organizing human groups without coercive power, without permanent inequality, without institutional structures that transcend individual lives. None of this means we should or could return to Paleolithic conditions. We cannot unknow what we know, cannot undo the transformations that agriculture and civilization have wrought, cannot and should not abandon the genuine benefits that material progress has provided. Medical knowledge, the conquest of infectious disease, the increase in human lifespan, the reduction of infant mortality, these are real achievements worth celebrating and defending. But in recognizing what has been gained, we might also acknowledge what has been lost. The deep social connection that came from living in small, stable groups where every individual was known and valued. The integration of meaning and the sacred into everyday life rather than confined to specialized domains. The freedom from institutional hierarchies and the coercive power they entail. The modest pace of life that allowed for rest and play alongside work. The intimate connection to the natural world that came from depending directly on it for survival. Some of these losses may be irreversible, the inevitable cost of the path human societies have taken, but others might be recoverable, at least partially, if we recognize their value and deliberately work to recreate them within modern contexts. We cannot return to bands of 20 people wandering the landscape, but we might create smaller, more connected communities within our larger societies. We cannot abandon technology and medicine, but we might question the relentless acceleration of pace and the elimination of rest from our lives. We cannot recapture the precise relationship to nature that existed when human populations were small and their impact minimal, but we might approach the natural world with greater respect and awareness of our dependence upon it. The hidden truth about Paleolithic life, the truth that emerges from careful consideration of the evidence and honest comparison with our own circumstances, is not simple or one-sided. They suffered in ways we do not. We suffer in ways they did not. Their advantages were real but came at enormous cost. Our advantages are real but have required sacrifices that we are only beginning to fully recognize. Perhaps what matters most is not determining who had it better, but rather understanding the full range of ways in which human life can be organized, the various trade-offs that different arrangements entail, the possibilities that exist beyond the narrow spectrum of what most modern people ever experience or even imagine. The Paleolithic world is gone, irretrievably lost except for the traces that remain in caves and burial sites and scattered artifacts. But its memory can still teach us, can still challenge our assumptions, can still remind us that the way we live now is one option among many, not the inevitable endpoint of human development. The elders in Paleolithic groups, those who held memory and wisdom, understood something that we have perhaps forgotten in our rush toward progress and accumulation. They understood that wealth was not in things but in knowledge, not in possession but in relationship, not in what you owned but in what you knew and who you were connected to. This understanding shaped their entire approach to life, creating a value system radically different from our own. When an elder spoke of a place where water could be found even in drought, they were offering something more valuable than any possession, more enduring than any tool. This knowledge could save lives, could determine whether the group survived or perished. Yet it could not be hoarded, could not be monopolized, could only be valuable if shared. The very nature of the most important resources in Paleolithic life, knowledge, skill, memory, meant that generosity was not merely ethical, but practical, that sharing strengthened rather than depleted. This created an economy of fundamentally different character than what would develop later. There was no accumulation because nothing could be accumulated. There was no investment because time horizons were immediate. You ate what you killed, used what you made, shared what you had, and moved on. The future was not something you saved for, but something you prepared for through maintaining relationships, through ensuring that others would remember you had shared when you had plenty and would share with you when you had nothing. Status in such a system could never become rigid or hereditary because it depended on qualities that had to be continuously demonstrated, that could not be transferred to offspring, that existed only in the living individual. A shaman's child might inherit genetic predispositions toward certain abilities, might receive training and attention from their parent, but they still had to prove themselves capable of entering trance, of healing, of communicating with spirits. If they could not do these things, no amount of lineage would grant them status. This fluidity had profound psychological effects. Individuals knew that their position in the group's social structure reflected their actual abilities and contributions, not accidents of birth or inherited advantage. This created a kind of meritocracy, though not in the harsh modern sense. Failure did not mean destitution or exile, and success did not mean wealth or power over others. It simply meant that those who contributed most gained most respect, and respect was the primary form of social reward available. Children growing up in such societies absorbed this understanding early. They saw that skill mattered, that memory mattered, that generosity mattered, that maintaining good relationships with others mattered. They saw that elders who became senile or whose memories proved unreliable lost influence, that hunters whose skills declined were treated with kindness but no longer deferred to, that shamans who could not heal eventually lost their position to others who could. This created incentives toward genuine competence rather than the appearance of competence, toward actual generosity rather than the performance of generosity, toward real connection rather than the manipulation of social networks. The groups were too small, the stakes too high, the feedback too immediate for deception to be sustainable. You could not pretend to be a skilled hunter if your hunts consistently failed. You could not pretend to shamanic power if your healing rituals never worked. You could not pretend to remember the location of water sources if you led the group to dry creek beds. The intimacy of Paleolithic social life, the constant proximity, the lack of privacy, the impossibility of hiding significant aspects of yourself from others, meant that reputation was based on observed reality rather than carefully curated image. Everyone knew everyone else's strengths and weaknesses, successes and failures, generosities and selfishnesses. There was nowhere to hide, no possibility of reinventing yourself by moving to a new place where no one knew your history. This transparency had costs. There was no escape from social judgment, no possibility of privacy when you needed it, no way to keep struggles or failures hidden. But it also had benefits. There was no loneliness, no possibility of being truly isolated, no experience of the particular modern suffering that comes from being unknown, from living among strangers, from lacking any deep connection to others. The spiritual life that existed within this social structure served partly as a way of managing the anxieties that came from living so close to danger, from being so vulnerable to forces beyond human control. The shamans offered explanations for events that might otherwise seem random. Why did this child sicken and die while another survived? Why did the hunt fail today but succeed yesterday? Why did the winter come early? Why did the river change course? Why did the game animals abandon their usual ranges? The answers provided: spirits were angry, the proper rituals had not been performed, someone had violated a taboo, were not scientifically accurate, but they provided psychological comfort, a sense of understanding and agency, even when actual control was minimal. If spirits caused misfortune, then proper ritual could perhaps prevent it. If the shaman could communicate with these spirits, then the group had a means of influencing outcomes, of negotiating with the forces that shaped their lives. This was not merely false comfort or self-deception. The rituals and beliefs created cohesion, reinforced shared identity, provided structure and meaning to experiences that might otherwise be overwhelming. The communal participation in ritual created bonds, affirmed the group's unity, gave individuals a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. The stories told about ancestors and spirits encoded practical knowledge in memorable form, ensuring its transmission across generations. Modern people looking back on these beliefs might see only superstition and error. But we miss something important if we dismiss them entirely. These systems of belief served real functions, met genuine needs, created meaning in a world that could seem harsh and arbitrary. They were not scientific in method, but they were not mere ignorance either. They represented sophisticated attempts to make sense of existence, to create frameworks for understanding, to answer the eternal, human questions about why things happen and what it all means. The integration of the spiritual into daily life, the lack of separation between sacred and mundane, meant that meaning was constantly available, constantly reinforced. You did not have to visit a temple or attend a service or read scripture to access the sacred. It was present in the proper treatment of animal bones, in the stories told around the fire, in the respect shown to certain places, in the acknowledgement that humans were not alone in the world, but surrounded by other intelligences, other presences, other forms of being. This worldview, sometimes called animism, saw consciousness and spirit as widely distributed rather than confined to humans. The animals you hunted were not mere resources, but beings with their own nature, their own right to exist, deserving of respect even as you killed them for food. The landscape was not inert matter to be exploited, but alive in some sense, populated by presences that had to be acknowledged, negotiated with, appeased. Whether such beliefs were literally true is beside the point. What matters is how they shaped behavior and experience. If you believe that animals have spirits that must be respected, you treat animals differently than if you see them as mere meat machines. If you believe that places have presences, you move through the landscape differently than if you see it as empty resource space. If you believe that your actions have consequences that extend beyond the immediately visible, you act with greater care, greater awareness, greater sense of connection to the broader web of existence. These beliefs created a kind of ecological wisdom, a way of living that limited exploitation, that encouraged sustainable practices, that maintained balance between human needs and the needs of other species. This was not because Paleolithic humans were more enlightened or more ethical than modern people, but because their belief systems and social structures created incentives toward restraint, toward taking only what was needed, toward maintaining the conditions that allowed for continued survival. The group's mobility reinforced this. If you moved through the landscape rather than settling permanently in one place, you could not exploit any single location to exhaustion. If you depended on wild animals rather than domestic herds, you had to let them reproduce, had to avoid killing so many that populations collapsed. If your tools were simple and your numbers small, your impact remained minimal regardless of intentions. This created a situation where humans lived within the environment rather than dominating it, where human welfare was directly tied to environmental health, where there was no possibility of externalizing costs or deferring consequences to future generations. The feedback was immediate. If you overhunted an area, you went hungry now, not decades later. If you polluted water sources, you suffered the effects directly, not downstream populations you would never meet. The contrast with our own situation is stark and troubling. We live in a world where consequences are distant, where feedback is delayed, where the costs of our actions fall on people far away in space and time, where we can destroy environments we will never see and harm people we will never meet. This allows for levels of exploitation and damage that would have been impossible in Paleolithic conditions, not because we are worse people, but because the structure of our societies permits, even encourages behaviors that our ancestors could never have sustained. The question then becomes, what aspects of Paleolithic social organization, of their value systems, of their ways of relating to each other and to the natural world, might be worth attempting to recover, adapt, or recreate within modern contexts? We cannot and should not try to return to their material conditions. The suffering was too great, the vulnerability too extreme, the costs too high. But might we learn something about how to organize smaller-scale communities within our larger societies? Might we reconsider the value of generosity, of knowledge sharing, of non-coercive leadership? Might we question the relentless accumulation that characterizes modern life, the treatment of everything as commodity, the reduction of all value to monetary terms? Paleolithic societies remind us that humans can live well, or at least live meaningfully, with very little material wealth, that the things that matter most cannot be purchased or owned, that status and respect can be based on contribution rather than accumulation, that hierarchy need not be permanent or coercive, that it is possible to organize human groups without the apparatus of state power and institutional control. They also remind us of costs we may not have fully reckoned with: the isolation that comes with privacy, the anxiety that comes with endless choice, the meaninglessness that can arise when life is not structured by immediate survival needs, the depression that affects people who live among millions yet feel profoundly alone. These modern pathologies were largely absent from Paleolithic life, not because those people were happier in some essential way, but because the conditions that create these particular forms of suffering did not yet exist. The elders, the shamans, the master hunters, all the people who held status in Paleolithic groups, earned that status through abilities that served the collective good. The shaman healed, the hunter provided food, the elder remembered crucial information. Their elevated position was justified by contribution, and their contribution was genuine rather than merely claimed. This created a social order that was hierarchical, but not oppressive, unequal, but not unjust, differentiated, but not alienating. Compare this to modern forms of hierarchy, where status often correlates poorly with actual contribution to collective welfare, where wealth can be inherited or obtained through manipulation rather than creation, where power operates through institutions rather than personal relationships, where the connection between what you do and what you receive has become obscure and often inverse. The comparison is not comfortable. It suggests that something important has been lost in the transition to complex society, something that made inequality more tolerable because it was more transparent, more justified, more tied to actual service rather than mere position. Yet we cannot simply recreate Paleolithic social structures within modern societies. The scale is too different, the material conditions too changed, the level of specialization too advanced. A modern shaman cannot heal infectious disease through ritual, cannot compete with antibiotics and surgery. A modern hunter cannot provide for a group's needs when that group numbers in the thousands or millions. A modern elder's memory, however sharp, cannot compete with written records and digital databases. So we are left with a puzzle: how to retain or recover the valuable aspects of Paleolithic social organization while accepting the irreversibility of the changes that have occurred, while maintaining the genuine benefits that complexity and technology have provided. This may be impossible, may be a nostalgic dream that ignores fundamental incompatibilities, or it may be achievable in modified form through deliberate effort to create smaller communities within larger societies, through rebuilding networks of genuine connection and mutual aid, through questioning assumptions about hierarchy and property and value that we have inherited but need not accept as inevitable. The painted caves, the buried bodies, the scattered tools, all the archaeological evidence of Paleolithic life speak to us across the millennia, not as directives or blueprints, but as reminders of possibility, as demonstrations that human life can be organized in radically different ways, that our current arrangements are not written into our nature, but are instead contingent, changeable, subject to being reimagined and reconstructed. As we drift away from this exploration of Paleolithic status and hierarchy, carrying with us the image of small groups moving through vast landscapes, of shamans entering trance in firelit darkness, of elders speaking memories that stretch back beyond living recall, of hunters whose skill meant life or death for those who depended on them, we might hold this thought. They were not primitives stumbling through prehistory, waiting for civilization to rescue them from brutishness and ignorance. They were fully human, cognitively and emotionally complete, living lives that were different from ours but not lesser, hard in ways we cannot imagine, but also rich in ways we have lost. Their world is gone and we cannot retrieve it. But in understanding it, in holding it in our minds alongside our own experience, we gain perspective on what is universal in human nature and what is particular to our own circumstances. We see more clearly what we have gained and what we have lost, what might be necessary and what might be contingent, what we should defend and what we might choose to change. And perhaps, in the quiet hours when sleep draws near, when the mind softens and drifts toward dreams, we can imagine ourselves back into that vanished world, feel the cold morning air, smell the smoke of dying fires, sense the presence of others sleeping close, hear the distant sounds of animals moving through darkness, see the stars spread across the sky in profusion beyond modern imagining, and know for just a moment what it felt like to live as humans did for most of our existence, before everything changed. We have journeyed far tonight, back through tens of thousands of years, into a world that no longer exists except in traces, scattered bones, stone tools, painted caves, the evidence that speaks if we learn to listen. We began with daily life, with the texture of survival, with cold mornings and uncertain food, and the weight of repetition that defined existence for those small bands of wandering humans. We met an individual who could not hunt yet lived 4 decades, kept alive by care and community, proving that compassion is ancient, that humans have always been capable of valuing life beyond utility, that the bonds between people can be stronger than the harsh logic of survival. His story reminds us that what makes us human is not our tool use or our language, but our capacity to see another person's struggle and choose to help, to extend life beyond what nature alone would permit. We descended into painted darkness, stood before images created by firelight 30,000 years ago, handprints left by people whose names are lost, but whose presence remains. The caves speak of mystery, of the human need to create meaning beyond the immediate, to make marks that will outlast individual lives, to build a second world of symbols and representations alongside the physical world of hunger and cold. They remind us that humans have always been more than mere survival machines, that we have always reached toward something beyond the practical, toward beauty and meaning and connection to forces larger than ourselves. And we explored the subtleties of status and hierarchy in societies that knew no kings, no permanent inequality, no institutional power. We saw how influence operated through demonstrated ability, how respect was earned rather than inherited, how even those with special status remained embedded in face-to-face relationships, dependent on the group they served. We glimpsed a social organization more fluid, more egalitarian, more directly tied to contribution than what would develop later. Through all of this runs a thread that we might now gather together as we approach the end of our journey. The Paleolithic world was hard, incomparably harder than anything most modern people will ever experience. The cold was bitter, the hunger was real, the vulnerability to injury and infection, and death was constant. No amount of romanticizing should obscure these facts. They suffered in ways we do not, and we should be grateful for the medical knowledge, the material security, the physical comfort that separates our lives from theirs. But alongside this hardship existed something else, a quality of life that in certain aspects might have been richer than our own. The social connection was deeper, more constant, more inescapable. No one was alone, no one was isolated, no one lived in the particular modern hell of being surrounded by millions, yet known by none. The children grew up held within the group's continuous presence, never doubting their belonging, never questioning their value, never experiencing the abandonment or rejection that scars so many young lives in our fragmented world. The work, though physically demanding, was limited in hours and meaningful in purpose. You tracked animals to feed people you loved. You gathered plants to nourish those who depended on you. You made tools that would be used by hands you knew, that would serve purposes you understood. The connection between effort and result was direct, immediate, visible. You saw the effect of your work in the faces around the fire, in the children who grew because you had provided, in the elders who survived because you had cared. The accumulation that drives so much modern anxiety did not exist. There was nothing to accumulate, nowhere to store it, no point in trying. You owned what you could carry, used what you needed, shared what you had. This created a kind of freedom, a lightness, an absence of the weight that comes from possessions, from property, from the endless maintenance and protection of things. The pace of life moved with natural rhythms rather than imposed schedules. You rose with the light, slept when darkness fell, moved through the day according to needs rather than clocks. There were no deadlines, no appointments, no obligations to be somewhere at a specified time doing a specified task. Time was abundant, or perhaps more accurately, time as we conceptualize it barely existed. There was only the present moment and its demands, only now rather than then, or when, or later. The spiritual or ritual life was integrated rather than separated, present in daily activities rather than confined to specific spaces and times. The sacred was not something you visited on weekends, but something woven through ordinary experience, in the treatment of animals, in the telling of stories, in the respect for places, in the acknowledgement that humans existed within a world populated by other consciousnesses, other presences, other forms of being. These qualities, deep social connection, meaningful work, freedom from accumulation, natural rhythms, integrated spirituality, represent genuine losses, aspects of human experience that complex civilization has eroded or destroyed. We cannot retrieve them in their original form, cannot return to bands of 20 people wandering cold landscapes, but we might ask whether we can recreate them in modified ways, whether we can build smaller communities within larger societies, whether we can create work that feels meaningful rather than alienating, whether we can resist the pressure toward endless accumulation, whether we can slow our pace and reconnect to natural rhythms, whether we can reintegrate meaning and the sacred into daily life rather than keeping them confined to specialized domains. These are not easy questions, and the answers are not obvious. The structures of modern life, the economy, the technology, the scale, the specialization, create powerful constraints, powerful incentives that push us away from these values even when we recognize their importance. It is difficult to live slowly in a fast world, difficult to live simply in a complex society, difficult to maintain deep connection in a culture of isolation, difficult to resist accumulation in an economy based on growth. But difficult is not impossible, and the Paleolithic example, for all its distance from us, for all the suffering it entailed, reminds us that alternatives exist, that human life can be organized differently, that the way we live now is a choice. Constrained, yes, but still a choice, rather than an inevitability written into nature or human nature. As sleep draws closer now, as your body settles more deeply into rest, as your mind begins to drift in that space between waking and dreams, perhaps you can hold this image. a small group gathered around a fire as darkness settles over the landscape, the flames casting shifting light on familiar faces. The cold kept at bay by closeness and shared warmth. The day's struggles concluded, the night's rest approaching. They are tired, these people around the fire, tired in muscles and bones, tired in ways we cannot fully imagine. But they are together, held within something larger than themselves, connected by bonds that need no explanation or justification, secure in their belonging even as they face an uncertain future. Tomorrow will bring its own struggles, its own demands, its own mixture of success and failure. But tonight there is warmth, there is food enough, there is the presence of others, there is the vast sky overhead, there is rest approaching. And perhaps, though this is speculation, though we cannot know their inner lives with certainty, perhaps there is something else as well, some quality of peace that comes from living fully in the present, from accepting life as it comes without the constant reaching toward elsewhere or otherwise that characterizes so much modern consciousness. They are here now is all there is, all there needs to be. This is not wisdom in any sophisticated sense, not philosophy or insight that could be articulated in words. It is simply the state that results from having no alternative, from living in conditions that permit no escape into fantasy or projection, from being embedded so completely in physical reality that abstraction becomes difficult. And yet it is a kind of wisdom nonetheless, or at least a kind of peace, the peace that comes from acceptance, from surrender to what is, from the cessation of striving toward what might be. What we, lying in our beds in our climate-controlled rooms, in our modern dwellings, surrounded by possessions and technology, and all the apparatus of complex civilization, might feel a strange envy for that peace, that acceptance, that simplicity. We have gained so much, years of life, freedom from pain, knowledge beyond measure, choices beyond counting. But we have also gained anxiety, gained the burden of infinite possibility, gained the peculiar modern suffering that comes from having everything yet feeling empty, from being free yet feeling trapped, from being connected to millions yet feeling alone. The Paleolithic people knew none of this modern suffering. They faced different demons, hunger, cold, injury, death. But they did not face the existential confusion, the meaning vacuum, the identity crisis that afflict so many in the developed world. Their problems were concrete, immediate, solvable, or unsurvivable, but never ambiguous. There was no question of who they were or what they should do with their lives. They were members of the group, and what they should do was survive, help others survive, and perhaps in whatever time remained, create something beautiful or meaningful or memorable. Is there a lesson in this simplicity? Perhaps, perhaps not. Perhaps the only lesson is that every arrangement of human life involves trade-offs, that every way of being human brings its own forms of suffering and its own forms of satisfaction, that there is no perfect organization, no social structure that eliminates struggle and maximizes flourishing for everyone. But if there is a lesson, it might be this. What we need to thrive is not primarily material abundance or technological sophistication or institutional complexity. What we need is connection, purpose, belonging, meaning, and these things can exist in the simplest circumstances or be absent in the richest. The Paleolithic people had almost nothing by our standards, yet they had each other, and perhaps that was enough. We have almost everything by their standards, yet many of us lack the very things they possessed in abundance. The deep knowledge of being held within a community, of having a clear role to play, of being embedded in relationships that give life structure and meaning. Let this thought carry you now toward sleep, toward rest, toward the quiet dissolution of consciousness that comes at day's end. You are lying in comfort they could not imagine, sheltered from cold they knew intimately, secure in ways they never were. Be grateful for this, but be aware, too, of what they had that you might lack. What they knew that we have forgotten, what their lives held that ours sometimes lack, despite all our advantages. The hidden truth about why cavemen sometimes lived better than us is not that their lives were easier or happier or more fulfilling in any absolute sense. It is that they possessed certain qualities of experience, deep connection, meaningful integration into community, clear purpose, natural rhythms, limited anxiety about the future, that we have traded away in exchange for comfort, longevity, and material abundance. Whether this trade was worth it depends on what you value, what matters most to you, what you think human life is fundamentally for. But perhaps that question can wait for another night, another time. For now, let yourself drift. Let your breathing slow. Let your body settle into the mattress beneath you. Let your mind release its grip on these thoughts and images and comparisons. The Paleolithic people are long gone, dust and bones and scattered artifacts. Their world is irretrievable. But for a few hours tonight, you have walked with them, seen through their eyes, felt something of what they felt. And now it is time to let them rest, to let yourself rest, to sink into the darkness that holds us all equally. Them then, you now, all humans across all time, bound together by the simple fact of consciousness, of having been alive, of having faced the eternal questions about how to live and what it means and whether any of it matters. Sleep comes softly now, approaching on quiet feet, bringing with it the temporary cessation of thought, the nightly death and rebirth that marks our days. Let it come. Let yourself go. Let the warmth hold you. Let the darkness welcome you. Let rest claim you as it claimed them, night after night, in caves and shelters under vast indifferent skies, until finally the last sleep came and did not end, and their bones became part of the earth, and their stories faded into silence, and only these traces remained to tell us they were here. They lived, they struggled, they created, they loved, they were human. As we are human, different in circumstance, but the same in essence, our ancestors, ourselves, the long chain of being stretching back to the beginning and forward to whatever ending awaits. Rest now. Sleep. Dream perhaps of cold mornings and distant fires, of animals painted on stone walls, of hands reaching across millennia, of voices telling stories in the darkness, of the strange, hard, beautiful life they lived before everything changed, before the world became what it is now, before we became what we are now. Back when humans were few and the earth was vast, and the ice held the north and the stars were so numerous, they formed rivers of light across the blackness, and sleep came easily because exhaustion was constant, and tomorrow would be like today, and there was no other way to live, no alternative to imagine, only the eternal present of survival and connection, and the quiet ongoing struggle to remain alive one more day, one more season, one more year, until finally the struggle ended and became memory, and memory became story, and story became archaeology. And archaeology became this quiet voice speaking to you across the void of time, saying they were here, they mattered, their lives were real, and perhaps, in ways we barely understand, they knew something we have forgotten, lived something we have lost. And sleep now, sleep. Let it all go, let consciousness fade, let the questions dissolve, let rest come as it came to them, as it comes to all, as it comes now to you, softly, gently, pulling you down into darkness, into dreams, into the quiet place where time stops and thought ceases, and only being remains, pure and simple and complete, until morning comes and the cycle begins again, as it always has, as it always will, world without end. Amen. Sleep, rest, peace, now here, finally, home.